Live for God Studio Productions.
This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
We're getting into a fascinating part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus began that series of teachings with the Beatitudes we looked at a few Sundays ago, and where he taught that when you understand your condition, what's going on in you and the things you're having to deal with, you can begin to see where God is taking you. For example, blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven. And when you understand where you are, what's happening, then you can begin to kind of see what God is doing in your life. Then Jesus addressed how God wants to make a mark on the world through you. He wants you to make a mark on the world, and He wants to actually make that mark through you. And through all of these teachings, He's saying it's not about all the do's and don'ts of the Pharisees. The things that He's teaching are kind of counter to the religious laws of the time, and that's what Jesus is really addressing in the Sermon on the Mount. The people were under this oppressive religious law, and Jesus is teaching them about to be careful about that law. The Sermon on the Mount is not about do's and don'ts. It is actually a declaration of freedom. A freedom from the oppression of religious law. Now remember, Jesus is teaching these things, and at the same time that He's teaching, He's backing up His authority by healing people, meeting needs in their lives, which is something that the Pharisees and Sadducees could not do. And in fact, at the end of this series of teachings, known as the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, and when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at His teaching, for He was teaching them as one who had authority and not as the scribes being the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the teachers of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So they understood that He was saying something so unique, so different. He wasn't oppressing them with the law, and He was actually backing up His authority to say all that by performing these things that He was doing. And He goes on after Matthew chapter 7, we'll see that He does some amazing things to prove His authority. We'll be getting into those in a few weeks, probably about 3 weeks. Matthew seems to have picked up on a very calculated and planned out introduction by Jesus to His ministry. It seems like that what Jesus is doing is very methodical, very focused. And His words and actions both seem to be saying, or asking the question, has the religious law you've been following healed you or met your needs? And of course the people would have to have answered that, no. Because Jesus was healing them, but the law that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were pushing on them certainly wasn't doing that, but Jesus was. And so the things that He's teaching and the things that He's doing is basically asking that question. Has the religious law that you've been following healed or met your needs? Let me show you and tell you a better way. Really what He's doing. And over the next several verses, we take a look at some of those laws. Jesus addresses some of those laws as examples of what He's talking about. And He begins these laws by saying, you have heard. And then He follows it up with, but I say to you. So there's a contrast. He says, you know what the law is. You've heard this law. But let me tell you about a better way. I'm telling you this. This is what the law says, and this is the way you understand the law. But I say this about that law. And every time He gives one of those examples, He explains that the issue is not about the law. In other words, the issue is why you need the law. That's really important to grasp in our study today. The problem is not whether or not you've obeyed the religious law. I mean, he's assuming that everybody's at least trying to obey the religious law. The problem is why you needed the law in the first place. And then he gives some instruction on how to deal with the issue, or he gives another example to make his point. So let's look at some of these. We'll look at the first three today. The first one is in verse 21. You have heard that it was said of those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. The council was every town had its own council authority that would rule on matters of discipline for the town. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Now, the root of murder is what is the real issue. That's what Jesus is talking about. He says the root of the murder is the real issue. Not murdering somebody doesn't solve the real issue. Just because you don't murder doesn't mean that you don't have a problem with it. And while murder has a whole different set of consequences, if you murder, there obviously are a whole different set of consequences. The real issue is why one would murder another. One is not more spiritual or more holy because one hasn't murdered someone if the real issue or the real cause hasn't been resolved. We're not going to solve, for example, we're not going to solve the problem of murder on the streets of Kansas City by simply enforcing the law. The real problem is the issue behind the murder. In other words, what are the issues that cause somebody to murder someone? This is why we're not going to see the issues in the Middle East solved by a peace agreement or an enforced peace. The real problem is what is behind the murders. What are the issues that bring it to murder? Once we solve those issues, then we solve the problem of murder. And so what Jesus is doing is he's saying, look, you need to understand that murder is a law. But I tell you that the issues behind the murder are what need to be dealt with. And Jesus gives three examples of what is really behind murder. The first one is anger. Now, anger is a rage that is often provoked by some sort of indignity. You said something to me, you did something to me that just made me so angry, and it was against my dignity, and I was offended by it. And so I respond to that rage. Sometimes that rage is caused by the person who gets murdered, but sometimes it's caused by other circumstances, and the murdered person suffers the consequences. So that's one of the three issues that Jesus says. The problem with murder is that it is actually caused by anger. That's the issue behind it. That's the issue that needs to be solved. The second issue is he uses the word insults. Actually, it's not the word he used. The word he used is lego, L-E-G-O. And it is the word that's used here. And it's a little difficult to understand in the American lingo, in our American English. It literally means a declaration. A declaration. So the way it's used here is to make a declaration against a brother or against another human being. It's not so much an insult the way that we know insults. It's not calling somebody a horse face as much as it is just passing judgment on someone, making an accusation, or slandering someone. That's what the issue is, a declaration against someone. In other words, having contempt for someone. That's what this word means. And this is evident. It's evident in racism. It's evident in harassment. It's evident in tribalism. We're the McCoys and we don't trust those Hatfields. It's a condemnation. It's contempt. It's contempt for another person. That's what the word means here about insults. The third word that's used is arrogance. Actually, the word fool tells us what it's like. It's not the word that's used. It's the example that says, don't call somebody a fool. The word fool is the word modos, and it means dull or stupid. And it's more like what we think of as an insult in our language. You treat somebody, you insult them. But The reason for that is what's important here. A person who thinks of another person or treats another person as dull or stupid is acting arrogantly and prideful, thinking themselves to be better or smarter, and that other person thinking that that other person doesn't deserve their respect or acceptance. And that kind of lack of respect, that arrogance, can lead to murder. So those are the three things that Jesus said are the issues behind murder. 1 Samuel 2, verse 3 says, "Talk no more so very proudly," talking about arrogance. "Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed." So what should you do if you have this almost uncontrollable, ongoing issue towards another person? Jesus gives a very practical approach to solving this issue. I love what he says. Starts with verse 23. "So, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you," that means that you've done something and your brother was offended. Maybe not your blood brother, but another person has done something and you've offended them. "Leave your gift there before the altar and go." Now, I heard a preacher preach a whole sermon one time. He says, that you should leave your offering first and then go take care of business. That's not what that's saying. That's saying you got another priority. That's what it's saying. You got something more important to take care of right now. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. I'm going to give you a free lesson within a lesson here. This is a little parenthetical thing, and I want you to catch based on what I was just talking about, leaving your offering. It's really important for us to get this. It's important for us to get this in this church. It's important to get this in any church. The idea here is that your offering is an act of worship. Your offering is an act of worship, and it needs to be treated that way. And so if you're worshiping and you've got this problem with somebody else, you need to take care of that problem. It needs to become a priority in your life. Take care of that priority, and then come back. It says, and then come back and offer your gift. Now, it's obviously saying, now you're ready, you've got your priorities straightened out. But it's important to understand that an offering is an act of worship. Remember, this is parenthetical. An offering is an act of worship, and it needs to be treated that way. And when churches do something during an offering that detracts from the worship experience of the offering, they're violating the concept of an offering. A church that does announcements during the offering, I think, is violating the very premise. When I'm giving my offering, I'm telling God, thank you for what you have done in my life. I'm giving my offering as a way of saying, I'm committing myself to you. I'm obeying you. I'm giving myself to you. In the meantime, somebody said, don't miss the women's meeting on Tuesday at 7 o'clock. If I'm God, would I be offended at that? You bet. And we need to understand that and stand for that. Do not violate the premise of what an offering is all about. It's worship. It needs to be treated as worship. And if it isn't treated as worship, it's slapping God in the face. That's the end of that parenthesis. I can get a little worked up on that, Okay, so Jesus is saying that when you're trying to be spiritual, and yet you know that you have offended another brother or a sister, make reconciliation the priority. It becomes more important than your worship at that point, because you have to be right with God. And if that means you have to be right with another person so that you can be right with God, then do it. Make it a priority. In a practical way, if you have offended someone and that offense has festered and grown to the point that you're headed to some sort of a judgment, what the verse says is come to terms quickly. Come to terms quickly. In other words, deal with it. You may not be able to resolve the conflict, but come to terms. Do you see what it says? It doesn't say solve the problem. You may not be able to solve the problem, but at least come to terms. Come to some sort of an agreement where you can have some sort of peace. Jesus is teaching that murder is usually the result of a deeper issue. It is that issue that prompts us to greater consequential sin. Those issues like, as Jesus said, anger, contempt, arrogance. If we don't take care of those issues, they will lead to broken fellowship with another person and broken fellowship with God. And then, on top of that, it may even lead to loss of freedom. In a legal sense, you may go to jail for the consequences of your sin. In a spiritual sense, you're already in jail. You've lost your spiritual freedom because you're out of fellowship. You've broken that real fellowship with God. So deal with it. In other words, this is really important to understand. The law can't fix the reason you need the law. The law can't fix the reason you need the law. The law can't fix the reason you need the law. We have a law in our books in this country that says you're not allowed to rob a bank. But the law can't stop the reason why people rob banks. The law can't fix the reason why we need the law. The law doesn't fix the real problem. Jesus was teaching them that they could do all the right things, obey all the religious laws, and still not be right with God. You can do all the right things in your spiritual life and still not be right with God, because you're treating it as a moral issue as opposed to a spiritual issue. You see, being right with God is not an action, it's a condition. The law can't fix the reason for the law. And by the way, that's exactly why Jesus, when he said, I have come to fulfill the law, that's what he was saying. The law can't fix the reason, but Jesus can. That's what he meant when he said, I've come to fulfill the law. The law can't fix the reason for the law, but I can.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.